Have you heard of the distant relative of William Shakespeare, who in the 1840s travelled hundreds of miles through Central Asia to negotiate the release of Russian slaves? And in the process, Lieutenant Richmond Shakespeare denied the Russians an opportunity to expand their empire closer to Britain's in India, and earned himself a knighthood too. This is the story of Shakespeare and the Great Game. Richard Campbell Shakespeare was born in Calcutta, India, in 1812. Whilst not 100% definite, Victorian sources certainly suggest that his branch of the Shakespeare family are descended from one of William Shakespeare's uncles, either Thomas or Henry. Certainly within 50 years of the Bard of Stratford's death, a John Shakespeare was living in the Shadwell area in what is now East London, and had established a rope-making business. By the birth of Richmond Shakespeare in 1812, this branch of the family had forsaken the final letter E in the more famous surname, although, interestingly, birth records for the previous 100 years had added and then removed it almost as the mood took. By 1812, this line of the Shakespeares had left the rope-making business and had entered the service of the East India Company, becoming one of the many Anglo-Indian families who for generations served the British Raj either in administrative or military capacities. Richmond's father, John Talbot Shakespeare, was employed in the Bengal civil service and had married into another Anglo-Indian family. His wife Amelia came from the Thackereys, and her nephew was the writer William Makepeace Thackeray, author of Vanity Fair and The Luck of Barry Lyndon, which, if you remember, was made into a film back in the 1970s. The writer, like Richmond Shakespeare, had also been born in Calcutta, less than a year before his cousin. The boys travelled together to England, where they were both educated at the prestigious Charterhouse Public School, after which their paths diverged. Whilst William Makepeace Thackeray would briefly attend Cambridge University before travelling and then writing, Richmond Shakespeare entered Addiscombe Military Seminary in Surrey in 1827. Addiscombe, which closed shortly after the Indian Mutiny, also called the Indian Revolt, was the training college for officers of the East India Company's army. A contemporary of Shakespeare's was Robert Napier, who would go on to command the British expedition that captured the fortress at Magdala in Abyssinia in 1868. 13 Victoria Crosses would be awarded to graduates of Addiscombe, including Field Marshal Lord Roberts of Kandahar, Bobbs, who attended the college in the 1850s. In 1828, Shakespeare was commissioned as second lieutenant in the Bombay Artillery. After a variety of postings in India, in 1838 he joined the Army of the Indus for the British invasion of Afghanistan. This first British war in Afghanistan is too complex and indeed too interesting to cover in this video, but the top line was that the British feared Russian plans to expand in Central Asia. Ever since Tsar Peter the Great, some in Russia had advocated expanding southwards through Central Asia to Persia, modern-day Iran, and India. It was something that Napoleon had also encouraged the Russians to do during the Napoleonic War. Why did they fear this? Because it would challenge British supremacy in India. And for that very reason, the British became almost paranoid of any signs of such expansion. Throughout the 19th century, both the Russians and the British sought to both expand and protect their empires in a series of political intrigues and military initiatives that became known as the Great Game. Central to this Great Game was Afghanistan. Because obviously, if you think about it, if the Russians controlled it, it brought them to the very edge of India. And likewise, the British saw Afghanistan as providing a buffer against that Russian advance and their own empire in India. But of course, that needed a compliant or pro-British regime in Afghanistan. And when they felt that the Emir in Kabul was getting a bit too close to the Russians, or simply not close enough to the British, they decided on a regime change. As I said, as usual with history, it's a lot more complex and interesting than that, but at least you now know why Richard Shakespeare was going into Afghanistan. He was with the column that marched on and then captured the city of Kandahar in April 1839. And just 2 months later, the 27-year-old was appointed political assistant to the British mission to the western city of Herat. It was now that Shakespeare entered the great game. Whilst the British had been trying to secure their Afghan buffer state, the Russians had indeed been making moves in Central Asia. Having suffered a major reversal way back in 1717 when they invaded the Muslim Khanate of Khiva, the Russians had been biding their time. Khiva was renowned as one of the most important slave trading markets in Central Asia. Tens of thousands of slaves passed through the city every year, mainly captured Persians, but also several hundred Russians. These Russians had been captured by Turkmen raiders crossing into Russian territory around the Caspian Sea, and the Russians wanted to release their fellow countrymen. It was also a very useful pretext for her military to advance into Khiva and then, well, never leave. In November 1839, the same year that the British invaded Afghanistan, a Russian army numbering 5,000 men under General Perovsky invaded the Khanate. Unfortunately for the Russians, their invasion coincided with one of the worst winters on record. Most of their supply animals died, and Perovsky was forced to turn back in February 1840, having suffered over 1,000 casualties to the weather. In the meantime, that invasion had deeply alarmed the British. If the Russian slaves were being used as a pretext for a Russian advance, then, the British decided, they needed to remove that pretext by convincing the Khan to release those slaves. The British political agent in Herat, Major Todd, dispatched Captain James Abbot, disguised as an Afghan, to Khiva on Christmas Day 1839. He arrived late in January, just as ironically the Russian invasion was about to turn back. Whilst he and the Khan couldn't speak to each other except through interpreters, the local ruler decided to send Abbot to Russia with a letter of friendship for the Tsar. However, Abbot was captured by Kazakh bandits before he could even reach the Russian border. Not knowing Abbot's fate, nor that Perovsky's invasion had ended in disaster, Major Todd now sent Lieutenant Shakespeare to Khiva to negotiate a release of the Russian slaves. Shakespeare left Herat in May 1840 and reached Khiva, 433 miles away across the Central Asian mountains and steppes, a month later. There, Richmond Shakespeare convinced the Khan not only to release the Russian slaves, but also to make the ownership of a Russian slave punishable by death. What a great way to ruin the Russian pretext for an invasion. On the 1st of October of that year, he arrived at the Russian border town of Orenburg with over 400 Russian men, women and children who had been released. Having been presented to the Tsar, who congratulated him on securing the release of those slaves, probably through gritted teeth, Shakespeare continued on to England, where he was knighted by Queen Victoria on the 31st of August 1841. And what became of Captain Abbot? Well, he was released by the Kazakhs and made his way to Britain via Russia. He would then return to service in India, eventually attaining the rank of general, and he died on the Isle of Wight in 1896. The city of Abbottabad, established in the early 1850s, was named after him. Now in Pakistan, it was just outside Abbottabad that Osama bin Laden was killed in his compound in 2011. Lieutenant Shakespeare also returned to India. By now, the British occupation and attempted regime change in Afghanistan was turning into a disaster. The British had been forced to retreat from Kabul, and in early 1842 their column made a desperate last stand at Gandamak before being effectively wiped out. He was now appointed military secretary to Major General George Pollock in Peshawar. Pollock was commanding a column to relieve Sir Robert Sale, who was besieged by the Afghans at Jalalabad. Like Shakespeare, Pollock was a graduate of Addiscombe and had also started his service in the Bengal artillery. During the advance towards Jalalabad, Shakespeare was mentioned in dispatches several times. When he, along with Pollock, finally arrived at the city in April 1842, they found that Sale had effectively broken the siege himself. General Sir Robert Sale would later be killed at the Battle of Mudki during the First Anglo-Sikh War, which I've talked about in another recent episode. Promoted to the rank of brevet captain, Shakespeare served as ADC to Sir Hugh Gough in the Gwalior campaign in 1843. A year later, at Agra, he married Marion Sophia Thompson, the daughter of yet another Anglo-Indian civil servant. They would go on to have 6 daughters and 3 sons. Promoted to regimental captain in 1846, he remained in Gwalior until 1848. He then once more joined General Sir Hugh Gough, serving in the Second Anglo-Sikh War. Present at the opening battle of Ramnagar, he received promotion to brevet major, and then commanded a battery of 6 guns at the Battle of Chilianwala in January 1849, and I've told the stories of both of those battles in the Sikh Wars in recent episodes. Shakespeare again commanded a detachment of guns at the final battle of the war, at Gujarat, where he was wounded in action. Having convalesced at a hill station, he moved into more political appointments. Starting once more in Gwalior, he was promoted to brevet lieutenant colonel in 1854 and a full regimental lieutenant colonel during the Indian Revolt or Indian Mutiny. He eventually became agent to the Governor-General for Central India. Sir Richard Campbell Shakespeare died in the city of Indore in 1861 from bronchitis. He was just 49 years old. He left behind Lady Shakespeare, 6 daughters and 3 sons. His cousin, William Makepeace Thackerey, died just 2 years afterwards. Shakespeare's successful rescue of over 400 Russian slaves did indeed remove the pretext for Russian intervention into Khiva in the 1840s. However, they were to return in the 1870s, and after overpowering the Khan's forces, Khiva became a Russian protectorate until the 1917 revolution. It's now part of Uzbekistan. That conquest of Khiva was part of a Russian expansion through Central Asia, which did indeed end up on the northern border of Afghanistan, heightening tensions with the British in India. The great game between Tsarist Russia and the British Empire continued until the First World War, when the Germans also made an appearance. And it resulted in espionage that's like something out of a spy novel, another British expedition into Afghanistan, and Francis Young Husband's slightly bizarre invasion of Tibet. But that, as they say, is for another day. Meanwhile, a big thank you to Stacey, Rob and Andreas for your generous support of my channel. And if you'd like to join them in supporting my work, then there are details in the description below. Thanks for joining me today. Keep well, and I'll see you again very soon.